Hello. It's Derek from One River Tea. Welcome back to another episode of Tea Soup, a podcast all about tea culture, life in modern China, and Chinese tea. I'm your host, Derek Poskin. I've been living in China since 2016, and I've been drinking, buying, and selling Chinese tea for the past decade. So, pop on that kettle, heat up your teaware, and let's get this session started. Alright, so the topic for this episode is sourcing Lapsang Souchong. In the last episode, I talked about the history of this world's first black tea coming out of Fujian, up north of the Wuyi Mountains, back in the Qing Dynasty. In this episode, I will talk about my own adventure to get out into that kind of restricted Tongmuguan region and find this tea and meet the people who are making it. And this tea actually has a really great family who creates it. And so I've been really dreaming about creating this episode for a long time because I have a good connection with them. I'm really pleased with what I found. And I'm really happy that we recently released some of the Lapsang Souchong and it got some love. It got a lot of support. A lot of people have tried it. And so if you're listening to this, maybe you've tried these teas. And in this episode, we will talk about the origin of it, where we found it, and how that tea got into your cups. But before we begin, naturally, I have a little bit of my own musings because running this tea company, not a day goes by that something happens that gets me thinking. And that's one of the reasons I love what I'm doing. I love doing this because there's always something. It's like I said, you have this little problem generator and every day it creates wonderful new problems for you to solve. It's not a boring day ever. And as a result, I'm always thinking about like, how did I solve that? How would I solve that? Going forward, how would I prevent this problem from happening? And one of the things recently that's been really getting me is the idea of working with the right people, of finding the right people to really tie this cooperation with and really commit to. Because some people, it's a loose cooperative. Other people, it's very loyal, very real. Like one instance is Wu, who I've mentioned before on the podcast. He was that tea farmer turned coal miner turned back into tea farmer in like the early 2000s, 2007, 2010, around that time. Because, he lives out in Guangyang and they're producing a lot of tea. However, at the moment, it seems like Guangyang is not in the highest demand as far as fooding regions of tea producers. And so this is the guy who was making brown shomei and saying like, hey, like a lot of people prefer the brown stuff, to the green stuff. And initially he was like, you could sell it for more money. It looks aged and stuff like that. And so initially I was kind of like, I don't know about this guy. But he's just kind of stuck around in what we've been doing for a long time. We've been working with him quite a bit because he has a nice little tea cake pressing factory. And so he was pressing those tea cake flowers that we had. We picked our own flowers out in Hubei and Hefeng. We shipped them to Wu, and he used his tea and pressed them into these little biscuits. I think a lot of you guys have had those. They're available on the website. However, beyond that, we haven't been buying a whole lot of his tea. In fact, we recently just sent a bunch of tea over there to get pressed, and he pressed it for us, and it was like, here's exactly how much it cost, and he's really not making any money off it. And so we've always kind of wanted to work with him more because he has just been really honest with us, reliable, consistent, like really not pushy. Like if we want to buy his tea, great, but he doesn't message us all the time like, hey, please buy more tea and stuff. And so it's an interesting kind of relationship there because it does feel like a nice little cooperation. Like he even asked us, hey, can I buy some of this like Dan Song tea that I just pressed for you guys, because it's really cool. But this is one of the things that has got me thinking about, like the small businesses, small companies, small tea farmers, the myth of it, who we want to work with, this idea of quality and of branding, and there's a lot going on. So before we get into Lapsang Souchong, which is the topic of this episode, I want to take a pretty deep cut into some of the musings that have been flowing around my mind recently. So please permit my brief tangent here so that I can talk about, or at least unpack, a very common trope in this world of trying to find high quality goods. This is, in my mind, is the idea of quality control that you find with small businesses. And so, of course, this is totally low hanging fruit. I mean, everyone seems like they've known about it, but it's like, how do we unpack it, right? Because there's also this myth, a correlated myth, that's like high mountain tea is better. Why is high mountain tea better? Because it's harder to access, because there are less pollutants, because of this and that. Why are the quality of goods you can get from small companies better? In my opinion, this is because there's more reputation at stake, right? In a big company, what you're trying to get is like maximizing profit at the expense of costs and stuff like that. And so you're getting the cheapest product you can possibly get for a certain amount of value. It seems like for the smaller factories, the smaller companies, people are much more concerned about creating the highest quality product they can. That way it kind of comes full circle and they get more work, they get more orders and stuff like that. I'm thinking of this old style of how it was done here in China, where you have masters, you have studios, you have masters that take in, a handful of apprentices and train them from a very young age. Say it's Kemin and Chaozhou who makes these really beautiful no-touch lids teapots, and he has a lot of apprentices, and he trains them up. As soon as they're ready, they go out and they create their own studios, and they kind of carry on this level of professionalism, this level of craft, this level of ability that is essentially the Kemin legacy, or in modern terms, we could even consider it the Kemin brand, right? And so it seems like in modern days, if you can't get a small company to do something, small business to do something, you get a high quality brand that has that same reputation. Now, the ironic part about this is when we first started One River Tea, that is kind of what we were into, was finding the smallest, most overlooked farms and regions that don't have a history of producing tea and trying to, support them by their teas. But what we found is, in Anhui, we went to this place called Longshan, and there's this people that used to be coal miners, the coal dried up, and they're selling like bamboo and tea, but the tea they're producing is really, really not good, and there's like no heart, no intention, no soul going into it. All they're trying to do is create products that, they can sell and get money. And so there's not this one-to-one between small farm and high quality, which is something that I think we need to kind of untie, right? This idea of like, oh, the smaller the farm, the better the quality. It also has so many other nuances about it. There's definitely a complicated truth. And the funny thing about this is what's getting me into this mindset is that I ran into this situation with it was a small printing press, and they were not printing press, but a printing company. They were printing the wrappers and stuff like that. But they just really didn't have that attention to detail, that desire. I mean, what they're also doing is they're also doing wholesale, and so they're creating a whole lot of packages for teas and stuff like that. Recently, I had a tea that I wanted to print, sent them the label, they printed it, they sent it to the factory with Woo wrapped it, and then I got the result. I got the actual tea cake, and I was like, the color is completely different. Like, it should be like bright gold, but it looks brown. And I messaged them, and they're like, oh yeah, just sometimes it's different. And it's like, obviously, this is just somebody working there who has zero passion about what they're doing. And it's just like, okay, like the zero kind of oversight. And what am I going to do? I'm not going to use them anymore in the future. I'm going to go somewhere else. And so this is kind of like the lifeblood of small businesses, is that reputation. And a lot of times when you find a small business, you can kind of rely on them needing that reputation. Otherwise, as I mentioned, you go to a big brand that already has established that fine reputation. And even though this is, very simple, very logical kind of stuff, I'm bringing my perspective as a business owner, as a small business owner who's totally obsessed with this idea of quality control, and everything from the social media, the photos, how we present ourselves, what teas we release, what teas we don't release, what prices we put on the teas and stuff like that. There's so much oversight that goes into this that it creates this very cohesive, if you will, brand. But in my mind, it's just that, yeah, it is that One River Tea cooperative, what we're doing, and everything that we stand behind. And so I'm very, very sensitive to it, that when I see someone, a small business that's lacking that, I'm like, oh, that's really unfortunate. However, I've also, worked a lot of jobs in my life. And even to my detriment, I have this proclivity of, if I'm giving my time to do something, I will, give it all of my attention. I will do the absolute best I can, even if it's, against my better judgment, where it's like I do good work and then I get more work. And I don't know, working by the wage, sometimes getting more work doesn't mean getting more money. And so that's essentially what drove me to create or co-found this One River Tea Cooperative, where the more time, love, energy, focus, and attention I put into this project, potentially the more I can see it grow. It's not this linear amount of, no matter how much hard you work, you only get this much amount of money, or you only get this much amount of returns. This, I can put in so much time and energy and get value back and give value, right? I mean, this podcast for me takes so much time and energy, and it's a totally free resource, and I love being at a place where I can offer that. Getting into this episode is about traditional technology and modern technology. This is about Lapsang Souchong, what we found out in Tongmuguan, where ironically, it's the older generation, the grandpa Zhang, who has adapted the modern production method for Lapsang Souchong, and the younger generation that is still carrying on the traditional smoked Lapsang Souchong. And we'll get into this when we meet these people, when you talk about where they are and their histories, and really just their belief in tea, because that really explains why the older generation is doing it in the modern way and the younger generation is doing it in the traditional way. Anyways, this episode all about Lapsang Souchong, or Zhengshan Shaozhong, out in Tongmuguan, which is just northwest of the Wuyi Mountains. And I think to start, we'll start here in the Wuyi Mountains back in 2021, I believe. So 2021 was actually pretty special for me because it was right after, COVID, right after things opened up a little more. I'd essentially quit my job and I was doing tea full time, which was a little difficult because of visa situations, but I won't get into that right now. But it was definitely risky because I was kind of in a gray area on the side of the law there for a while. Wouldn't recommend it. Highly would not recommend it. Anyways, with great risk comes great reward, and during that time I was able to travel all through China without limit and just go to all of these tea places, explore all of these tea regions, and really just with no bar there. And so in 2021, if you remember the white tea episodes, I talked about having a little white tea tour in April. After April, I went to Wuishan, and in Wuishan, I was really just trying to take some time off and just take a little relaxing time, travel the Wuyi Mountains, hike and stuff, and I managed to do that. But I was also with Yao Yao, Rainy from Serene Tea at the time, and when the two of us were together, naturally stuff became about tea. And so we started talking about tea, drinking teas, looking at the different Wuyi oolongs and stuff like that. Oh, but actually one thing that goes back into this idea of people that really care about what they're doing, we were staying at this small hostel, and this small hostel is family run by somebody who would really just be in the common room the entire time, and he would make hot soup every night, and he would just like the soup of the day, and it's just free for all of his guests. And he was a guy who was just absolutely loving his life and just doing what he wanted to, and you could tell he loved people, and people would come in and he'd try and get them just to stay in the common room and just talk. And he's the guy who's like managing the whole hostel. He's running the whole thing. It's his hostel. He's a native of the region, and he's making soup for everyone every night. And so this for me is getting back to that idea of small companies, of like good brands, like people that are actually really caring about the work that they're doing and not just doing faceless work, right? They're not just some employee at the front desk. This is the guy who's making you soup every night, knocking on your door like, hey, did you get tonight's soup? It's beans with a a little bit of lotus flower in it. And they're like, great, thank you. And actually, I don't know if I got into this when I was talking about my time in Japan, but there were a few instances where I ran into people like that, or more instances in Japan than in China, where I found somebody they had their whole life just tied into their business. You know, it's an inherited business. It was the Tosai people outside of Kiyomizu-dera Temple in Kyoto, the people that had been making teaware for generations. It was the guy who was just making gyoza, just fried dumplings in this tiny space, and he made everything by hand, and he was so focused on it. It was the guy in Uji who had the izakaya restaurant. Late night, it's just one guy knew all of the regulars. We come in and he's just like, oh, hello. And then he's just doing absolutely everything by himself. Old guy who's just been there forever. The Japanese word for this is shokunin, and it's the artisan. It's somebody who's achieved this really, really deep level of mastery in their singular craft. And they're so committed to it, and they're so focused on it, the whole world dissolves. And that's all they're trying to do. That's all their ambitions, is putting everything into it. And maybe this guy who's running the hostel in Wuyi Mountain Town is not that total true avatar of the shokunin, but seeing somebody who really, really cared about what they were doing was so invigorating for me. Like it felt like I was in the right place. And so I'll tell you this story later, because we actually came back to the same hotel with the same guy because of this. And talking about, you know, the guys printing the paper, of course, like, you print the paper and you don't care, I'm not going to come back to you. But if you really, really put in the care and the effort and the energy, you've got me. Like that's how it should be done. That's how business should be done. It's, you build this trust. Anyways, as I mentioned, the story is starting here in the Wuyi Mountains. And why is that? It's because Tongmuguan is just like an hour and a half drive from the Wuyi Mountain Scenic Reserve. And this is something maybe a lot of people don't realize. In my mind, it's like Zhang Xiaozhong or Lapsang Souchong is the black tea of the Wuyi Mountains. And so these are like brother, sister. It's like the black tea from Tongmuguan and the roasted oolong from the Wuyi Mountains. These are essentially one style of tea because the regions are just so close together. Naturally, you know, the Jinjun Mei is also from Tongmuguan, the Lapsang Souchong, so like the initial like gold bud black tea, the original gold bud black tea, and that smoked black tea, the world's first black teas, come right out of this birthplace of a lot of new teas in northwestern Fujian and Jiangxi. So even though I will probably do a full episode on the Wuyi Mountains and sourcing Wuyi oolongs and all of those teas and stuff like that, this episode still kind of has the same jumping off point. And so I might as well talk about the Wuyi Mountains for a little while because they're very fascinating. As I mentioned in the history of tea, this place has been making tea for a very long time, right? Since like earlier than the 1500s, 1400s, Song Dynasty, maybe even into the Tang Dynasty. However, the roasted oolong, that's particular style, didn't come around for a long time. I think I mentioned the getting the Huangshan monks out there to teach them how to make tea in like that Ming Dynasty era when they're starting to do all of the loose leaf tea instead of steaming pressed into tea cakes to be powdered in the Tang and Song. Anyways, the region itself, it's a tourist place in China for a lot of people because it's really spectacular. It's a World UNESCO Heritage Site five A's, whatever that means. It's a really beautiful place. Has incredible diversity in its fauna and flora. We saw a lot of really interesting birds. I think I saw a dragon. I actually did not, but it could be a place where a dragon would live. If I was a dragon in China and I was looking for dragons, this would be one of the places. A bit on the tourist side of things, the way they sell tickets to get into the Wuyi Mountains, I think they do like a 4-day ticket price, which is really expensive for like 4 days in the mountains. They do the same thing in Zhang. And actually, it's really useful because you cannot see very much in just one day. You can maybe see like one or two specific parts of the place, of this huge nature reserve. One thing I like about the Wuyi Mountains is that there are just paths that just crisscross all through it. And then at certain points, you can end up in the Zhangyan. And the Zhangyan is that, that place where all of the best Wuyi Mountain oolongs come from. It's literally within the scenic reserve. You kind of like, the way I came across it is I hopped across this, stone path across a little stream, climbed up this little peak away from the main tourist scenes, and I just started seeing groves and groves of tea. And then you get to a place that's this beautiful valley, really, really close valley, like maybe like 10 meters across, and just sheer cliff walls, and the cliffs are at an angle. And you could just imagine all of the rainwater and the minerals just running down the slopes of the mountain into this really, really fertile stretch of land. And for me, that is the iconic Zhangyan, which just means like the center of the stone, right? Or as the dwarves would call it, the heart of the mountain. And I remember the first time I went to Wuyi Mountains, I'll save this for the Wuyi Mountain story, I guess. I got lost in the mountain. It was pretty spooky. Anyways, so Yaya and I, we bought these tickets for the 4 days. We spent like 2 days just walking around the mountains, just looking at all the beautiful sights, because it is absolutely stunning. One night we returned to the hostel, and the guy in the comm room, the bean soup guy, is just like, you don't have to pay for a ticket, right? We were like, what? He's like, yeah, you can just you enter it, and there are a lot of the scenic places are free, and you don't need a ticket. You only need a ticket to like get into the place where they have like the ancient Da Hong Pao, the original trees on the cliff and stuff like that. But you can also end up in that place if you just hike through the mountains. And so there's no real true entrance gate ticket that you need, but you need a ticket. One of those 4-day tickets gets you into any of the scenic spots. And so he's like, yeah, like next time just stay here, and yeah, I can drive you up into the mountain every day if you want for free. Like, that's really awesome. Thank you. And so that's just a shout to anyone who's interested in going to the Wuyi Mountains, but you don't want to buy the really expensive ticket price. You can actually just go into the mountains, but you will need like a private car or a taxi or something like that to take you into the mountain. For those more interested in Wuyi Mountain teas, you can't really buy a whole lot of tea on the mountain itself. What you need to do is you need to go to the small town that kind of grew up around the Wuyi Mountains. I think it's called Sangu. Sangu, like 3 valleys, is like the name of the village, and it's just tea house after tea house after tea house. However, if you're on the main drag, it is very touristy. And so the teas are, very not so good teas, sold at really expensive prices, packaged really well. Of course, you can find small, nuggets of like really nice tea, honest people and stuff like that, but it's mostly for tourists. And so if you really want to get like the good teas, obviously you have to go off the beaten path. And since, we didn't come here necessarily to source tea, it was just kind of an afterthought, Rainey reached out to a mutual friend that you guys might even know. It's the Sweetest Dew, Dylan from the Sweetest Dew. And he was like, hey, if you're in Wushan, you should go see my maker of the yancha that I really like. And he sent us like the address or whatever, and it's off the beaten path. And so for us, we're like, yeah, this sounds exactly right. And so we make a plan to go there. And honestly, it's getting back to the Sweetest Dew and Dylan, like he mentions this because he's lived in China for a long time, sourced teas as well. He's got his own, feeling for it, right? And one of the things is when you go into a tea house, when you meet the tea maker, you either click or you don't click. And this kind of goes back to what I started this episode with of finding people that I want to do business with. Finding people that work really well with me and work really well with the cooperative. And sometimes you find it, other times it's like, okay, it just doesn't quite feel right, doesn't gel. And that was my experience meeting Dylan's, tea maker. I did not connect with him in any profound way at all. And so that means I don't, naturally, none of my yanchas come from this maker. And so if you want Dylan's teas from this maker, you have to go through Dylan. Anyways, Rainey and I go out there, and the guy is doing a live stream. And obviously, yeah, like one of birds of a feather. If you know Sweetest Dew, he's always doing lives. And we get there to this place, and his yancha maker is doing a douyin, a live stream. He's got a full crew. He's got the lights. He's got the mics, and he's in this room showing his tea off, telling people, oh, if you buy now, you get a discount tea. This is what it looks like. And he's pouring the tea, explaining the tea and stuff like that. But we're kind of not even allowed in the room because it's like such a professional like live stream going on. He doesn't want to get distracted. And so like, even though we messaged the guy, even though we told him we were coming tonight and he was like, oh yeah, come over around 7, we get there around 7 and he's occupied. And so initially I'm just like, okay, that wasn't very welcoming, I guess. We go into the other room with his wife and she's making the tea for us, answering some of our questions, but not in very much depth. Like she doesn't have the full grasp of what a lot of the teas and stuff. And then also the teas that we're sampling, I was not super impressed with. However, a lot of times when you're drinking teas, sometimes people don't give you the best stuff first. Sometimes it's just like, oh, it's just tea, we talk, blah, blah, blah. And then eventually they'll bust out some really nice teas. I don't think we even got to that part, so none of the teas I drank there were really impressive. I was a little tired from hiking all day, and eventually I left even before the guy finished his live stream. And so maybe I was a little rude there too, but anyways. Yeah, so we left their little production facility. The wife gave us a tour of like, all their machinery. Looked pretty nice, not so big. It was a good size, and so definitely a good candidate if we had that connection. But anyways, another thing to realize is that for Wuyi Yancha, we're here in mid-April. I think it was like April 12th. They're still not even picking. And so there's no oolong production going on yet. And so all of the machinery is kind of sleeping and waiting. All the teas are from last year. It's not the most exciting place and time to be in Wuyi Mountains. I mean, there's a lot of the potential energy of things about to start. Everyone's looking at the buds and stuff. It's like that early spring green tea kind of buzz feeling, but not a whole lot of action. So we leave, and we're getting a taxi back to our nice little hotel. We're going to get some bean soup. And across the street, we see steam coming up from a facility where they're making teas. And outside there's, a lady standing out, like kind of like getting some fresh air because inside is so steamy and hot. And this is precisely one of those lucky moments. It's the right place, the right time, the right people, and everything's conspiring. All we have to do is we have to kind of jump tracks, right? Like we're prepared to go back to the hotel. We have the Didi ordered. We have the Uber ordered. The Uber's on the way. But there's this really excellent opportunity. We're in that production facility region of Wuishan, and they're making tea right here. And so, yeah, Rainey is like, do you want to check this out? And I'm like, you know what, let's do it. And so I cancel the Didi. And that was an incredibly great decision because we walk over and we get this really excellent connection that we had no idea we were going to get. This is one thing I love about China is like it's not late at night. It's like 7 or 8 p.m. We can just walk up to a stranger while they're making tea and just ask to check it out. And she welcomes us in and just runs us through the whole process. This is our initial experience with Bebe Zhang. We get tea from them up in the Masu, but this is their facility down in the Wuyi mountain town. And what they're making here is their Tongmuguan black tea. So if you look at the black teas we offer from the region on our website, we have two different teas. One is the Tongmuguan black tea, and then the other is the Masu black tea. And I'll explain why they're so different. But the main thing is, the age of the tea trees, where the tea trees come from, and essentially also where they're processed. A lot of it is processed, the Tongmuguan stuff is processed in their Wui mountain town facility, where the Masu stuff is processed up on the mountain. Anyways, we get in there and I'm super stoked because this is the first bit of tea that I've seen being produced here in Wui Mountain Town. I take it back. I'm actually a little disappointed because it's not Wui Mountain Oolong tea. It's black tea. And I'm like, who cares about black tea? It's one of those funny things where in no part of my mind was I interested or thinking about sourcing Lapsang Souchong or Jinjunmei, any of this Tongmuguan black tea. But, it's something interesting. It's something going on. Bebe is really welcoming. And she's explaining that she's one of the members of the Masu Village Committee. And so she's actually, not really important. She doesn't use these terms. But she's like, yeah, like we're from Masu and we make the Masu tea. This stuff is from the Tongmuguan region. But up on the mountain, if you're interested, we could check that out. And I was like, oh, that's really, really cool. Like, well, let's go to your tea house tomorrow and we'll drink tea and we'll sample your teas and stuff. But in the meantime, we walked around their little production facility, very modest, not super big, even smaller than the Wui Mountain guys or the Wui Yancha guy we just came from across the street. However, there's a lot of smoke in the air, and I'm like, oh, are you guys making smoked Lapsang Souchong? And they're like, nope, this is the new Shin Gong Yi, the new production method. This is not smoked. Anything that's smoked comes from our village up top in Masu. Even if it's Tongmuguan material, they'll still smoke it in their traditional Qinglo up on the mountain. And I was like, that's something I really want to see. However, she says that a lot of what they're doing, they won't actually start making until later. Because the tea that they're making here is from the lower elevation, has earlier germination. It's, not as expensive as the stuff that they'll make later from the mountaintop. And so if I really want to see them make stuff from the mountaintop, I'll have to come back in May. However, since we're here at night and actually in the production facility, they don't have any tea that's ready to drink. And so Bebe is like, if you guys want, tomorrow come to my tea house. I have a lot of backstock. We can sample through a bunch of teas. And if you're interested, I can take you up to the mountain the next day. And so that's what we did. Rainey and I still had, we bought that 4-day pass. And so we still had like 2 more days that we wanted to get the value out of exploring Wui Mountain. And so the next day we explored Wui Mountain and then we visited Bebe in our shop. And let's see, Rainey and I, at this point, we'd been essentially sourcing tea for a few months together. We went to the Phoenix Mountains for the Dansong Oolong teas. She went to a place to get green tea. I went to a different place to get green tea. And then we met back in Fuding, sampled a bunch of white teas. And so we've kind of developed this sense of understanding each other's tastes and communicating to each other when we're sourcing teas. And so we get to Bebe's place, and she gives us a tea. And I drink it, and I immediately think, oh my God, this is incredible. And at the same moment, I feel Rainey kick me under the table, and we're trying our best to keep a poker face. That's the one of the main things is like when we don't really know somebody and they give us like really good tea, we don't want to tell them this is amazing tea, shut up and take my money. And we want to be like, okay, like what are you going to tell me about this tea? And so like, yeah, like she kicks me under the table. I look at her, I give her those eyes that are just like, yeah, I know this is really good tea. Let's see what she says about it. Because at the same time, like I mentioned, sometimes when you're sourcing teas, they won't give you the best tea first. Sometimes they just give you a random tea and talk, and then eventually they give you the good teas. Other people like to really test you, and they'll give you really good teas right away to see if you understand. And so it's like, for us, like we're drinking this tea, and Bebe is like hawk-eyeing us, looking at us, like, what do you guys think about this tea? And maybe I'm more honest, and I'm just like, it is really good. This is pretty good tea. I don't tell her it's the best black tea I've ever had, even though it was at that time. And I'm like, what is this tea? And she's like, this is the tea we make up on the mountain. This is the old bush Masu. This is our signature tea. And she starts explaining, it's Masu has larger leaves. They have, you usually pick it later in spring, has a stronger taste to it. And then this is from, a few years back. And so she's saying like, it's really good after you let it mature for a year or 2 years, and it gets this really nice texture. And I'm just like drinking it. I'm like, this is unbelievably good. I don't say it to her, but I'm just like, yes, I want to take me to the mountain, baby. Like, I want to buy this tea. I want to source this tea. I want to know where this tea comes from and why it's so good. And eventually, yeah, like we drink that, and then I ask about, oh, what about the tea from last night? She brings that. It's the Tongmuguan stuff, and it's still really good, but it just doesn't have that mineral depth. And it was really cool first starting with the Masu stuff and then going the Tongmuguan stuff and realizing like, okay, like that is why this tea is so different and why it costs 2-3 times the price. If you look at our website, One River Tea website, we do sell the Tongmuguan sampler, and that has the Lapsang Souchong sampler. It has Tongmuguan teas that I'm talking about now, and then it also has the Masu teas, and you can kind of taste the difference in that sampler. I think it should be really fun. I really enjoy doing these back-to-backs and understanding the differences because it reflects what it feels like to be in a tea house with the maker who's talking you through all of the different flavors, the different teas from the different regions, different dates and stuff like that. And really like when sampling teas and understanding teas, you understand through comparison. The only way you can really understand tea is by drinking a whole lot of teas and a whole lot of different teas. And it's cool when you can meet with a maker and they can really guide you to it. And so I've taken a lot of the samplers, I've taken my experiences in these tea houses and I've put them into the samplers that we create, hoping to kind of have that curated educational experience of tea exploration. Anyways, after drinking Bebe's black teas, I'm 100% sold on it. I'm so committed to it. I'm like, okay, like we talk about prices and they're within an acceptable range, especially having the more expensive Masu and then the more affordable Tongmuguan. Because, I don't want to only carry the highest quality, most expensive teas. I want teas for everybody at any place, right? And so it's nice to have that range. And so knowing that I can buy this and put it on the site, I'm like, yeah, baby, take me to the mountain and I want to see these bushes. I want to see the production facilities and whatnot. And so we plan to go the next day. Even though Yao Yao and I have, still one day on that pass, we decide, this is a really good opportunity. Let's use this time to go up onto the mountain and see what this is all about. Now, geographically speaking, Tongmuguan is literally a pass, a mountain pass. So Guan means pass, and then Tongmu is the name of the village, the region. Tongmuguan is a pass between Jiangxi, the province of Jiangxi in the northwest, and then Fujian in the southeast. And there's this mountain range that kind of blocks the two. And then there's this river that cuts through it. And this river creates the Tongmu Pass. And this region historically has been a site of, military importance in the local region. And I think there's still a military base there, which is why its entrance into the Tongmuguan is really restricted. And so people can't just wander into it. There are military, not necessarily military checkpoints, but government checkpoints to enter the region. And so you can't just pass through it. You can't drive into it. You can't enter it unless you're with somebody who's, showing you around. And as a result, it has this interesting mystique about it, where it's like when I tell Chinese people that, I've been to Masu and Tongmuguan, they're amazed. They're like, how did you get in? It's like, it's really not as hard as it seems, even though it is, guarded, entrance is prohibited. You can't fly drones around it. Anyways, what happens is the next day we get up and it's raining. This region, this time, this season, characterized by heavy rains. And so it's a perfect day to go up into the mountain and not go hiking around Wuyi. And so, yeah, we call Bebe. Bebe comes and picks us up from the hotel and drives us out to the Tongmu Pass. Now, as I mentioned, it's about an hour and a half drive from Wuyi Mountain town to the Tongmu Pass. And this is really an easy drive, kind of flat lands around the mountains. Here I see endless fields of tea bushes, and this is where probably a lot of the yancha comes from, right? A very small portion comes from the more, highly priced, highly valued region within the Wuyi Scenic Reserve. A lot of it probably comes from this exterior regions. However, we drive through all of these tea fields, eventually get up higher elevation and then down towards by the river. And we're following the river, and the river is, in torrents because it's been raining so much this spring. And as I mentioned, there is the checkpoint, the military checkpoint where, they stop all the cars, they check who's inside, and they make sure that you have the right permits to enter the region. Now, it sounds a lot more intense than it really was, especially in our situation, because they know Bebe, right? Bebe is on the village committee. She has the right license plate. She has the right car. It's registered. She comes in and leaves, and she also brings people up to her tea mountain all the time. And so the people see Bebe, they say hello, they check and see us, and Bebe's like, yeah, just showing them the mountain. They're like, okay. And they wave us through. That was that. Really, really easy, actually, instead of like a very difficult, hard to access region. As long as you're with the right people, it's pretty easy. Bebe has a story of this one guy that they met on the way up the mountain who was from Shanghai, and he apparently had walked in, and he was walking up the mountain to like the villages, and they were totally weird guy. They were like, what are you doing here? He's like, I just wanted to see the tea. I'm just here for the tea. And they're like, why are you walking? He's like, I just couldn't find a ride. And it's like, okay, like, it's going to take you like 4 or 5 hours to hike up to the villages. And he's like, oh, I didn't know it was that far. It's like, and so they took him in. But again, it's like usually the people here are with, the farmers or with the people that live there. You don't get a bunch of stray villagers or stray travelers and stuff in the region. Anyways, it's raining really hard and we're right by the river. And so all of the rain from the mountains are coming waterfalling down the mountainsides. It's actually really beautiful and kind of scary because some of the roads are just like you have to like hydroplane through them. And it's pretty okay. And then we turn off the main road from the river and we start going up the mountain towards Masu. Masu is located at the top of the Tongmu Pass. It's one of the very core production regions for the Zhang Souchong, and it is the highest of the, I think, 12 villages in the Tongmuguan region. Masu is typically the most highly sought after black tea from the region because it is the highest altitude, the most difficult to access. And so, again, we just lucked out running into this contact that can take us all the way up to Masu. And if you're curious, I also made a video of this very soon after I explored it all. And it's on the One River Tea YouTube channel, discovering the Tongmuguan Lapsang Souchong, sourcing Lapsang Souchong. And you can see the trip up there. You can see the people I met and stuff like that. I had a really nice time lapse of the journey up the mountain. But I think one thing that didn't get on into the video is the a video of Rainy in the back seat as we're going up this really, really uneven, bumpy mountain road with unending hairpin turns. She's just being tossed around like a rag doll, and she's like, I am dying. I never want to come here again. This is the worst it's ever been. And for me, yeah, I would say I've ranked my really, really terrible tea roads before, like the worst areas to get to in sourcing tea in China. And I think Masu Village is my number one. It is the absolute worst because it takes forever to get there. The roads are in a constant state of disrepair and just absolutely, nauseating. Hairpin turns, puddles, like dip holes. potholes everywhere. And it's funny because I talked to Bebe's grandfather, and he says, they didn't have a road until like the 80s or 90s. And so the only way into the village was hiking by foot through the mountains. And so for him, even if the road is in a state of disrepair and not the best road and really bumpy, it's still a huge leap forward. Anyways, the rain starts to kind of clear up before we get to the village proper. And so by the time we pass through the final stretch of bamboo, this region is incredibly full of bamboo and pine trees. As this scenic area is a nature reserve, the Tongmuguan Reserve, there's a lot of really rare flora and fauna up here that just can't be found elsewhere in China. And so by the time we clear the last stretch of bamboo and look down into the small mountain valley that contains Masu, it feels like it's, the sun coming out of a cloud. All of a sudden, we go from really tight bamboo, pine forest, hairpin turns to this open stretch of a valley with small buildings here and there, traditional wooden buildings, the Qinglos, and slightly more modern brick buildings. It feels like it's, the Garden of Eden. it's like this pristine mountain valley hamlet that took so long to get to. There's so much effort, past the guards, up the mountain, through the rain, the bumpiest road imaginable, and finally we've arrived. And it's really cool because we get there and it's the sun finally came out. It feels like another world. And Bebe's house and production facility is up kind of on the top of a ridge. And so she drives us through the village entire until we get to the top. And it's right around lunchtime. And so as soon as we get there, we meet Bebe's, father, mother, and grandfather, and they're all starting to prepare lunch. And so, we walk around, we take some photos and stuff like that, and then sit down to this really not elaborate mountain fare, but a lot of different dishes. And for me, I've had a lot of mountain food and a lot of village food. And just as I feel like Masu has a lot of extremes here because, it's the bumpiest road and also probably my least favorite food. I don't remember finding anything I liked to eat there. They have a lot of bamboo, and I usually really love bamboo, but like every way they prepared the bamboo I didn't like. It was there was a lot of fermented stuff going on, and I like fermented stuff, but it tasted like burnt, it tasted black, it tasted off. Like I just couldn't really wrap my head around the food up there. But what they did have is a lot of distilled spirits, and so they have like the moonshine they make up there, and then they're they're steeping a lot of local mountain fruits in it. And so that was a really cool exploration of like what is this mountain village life like, and I don't know, a lot of really cool fermentation things going on, steeping, distillations, and whatnot up there. After lunch, we go up and we explore the tea fields behind Bebe's house. And this is where I'm really impressed and amazed, and I understand why their teas are so different. These are hands down the oldest black tea bushes I've ever seen. And one interesting thing is they're not that old. It's a funny idea here between like what is gushu and laosong, and what is old bush and young bush. These bushes are probably 80 years old, maybe over 100 years old, some of them. But in this region, that is really old for tea bushes, especially black tea bushes. As you kind of leave Yunnan has, 100-year-old trees pretty easily. As you leave Yunnan, it gets more and more difficult, especially as you progress north into China. You get more trees that are, 40 years old, 30 years old, maybe some that are 80 years old, 60 years old. But like it's really difficult to find one of these younger trees that's over 100 years old. I remember in Fuding, they showed me one of their oldest tea trees in like the village, and it was like just over 100 years old. And they're like, this is the oldest tree I've ever seen. And it's like, okay. And so it's difficult. You can't measure Laosong or Gushu, and that's why there's no set age for what determines Gushu and what determines Laosong and Old Bush and whatnot. However, in this region, the bushes up behind Bebe's house, that is my oldest tea bushes I've seen in that Fujian region, in that Wui Mountain area. And they are beautiful. They're really spindly, gnarly. There's lichen growing on them. And there's moss hanging off of them, and they're producing just a few buds. Again, this is still early in the season, and so no one's really even picking tea. What they are doing is they're picking Jinjunmei, but this is that, maybe like 100 grams a day kind of kind of style of black tea, where it's like the most expensive, smallest yield kind of teas are being produced right now, and so there's still not a whole lot going on. As I mentioned, we saw Bebe making tea down below, but that was from the lower elevation tea gardens, not this high elevation Masu stuff. And in addition, the Masu is characteristically large, gnarly leaves. My tea master can tell the difference between Masu and not Masu just by looking at the leaves. And so it's really that characteristic of this region, of this highest point in the Tongmuguan region. Yaya and I took out, a phone, had like the elevation on it, and we're able to see we're up over, I think 1,400 meters. And so it's really, really high up in comparison because we came up from the river, right? We came up from a place that was just a few hundred meters above sea level to, 1,500. Another interesting thing about this region is that being so isolated, you have a lot of self-sustenance. And so bamboo is the most common tree out here. And so there are bamboo shoots growing up everywhere, and they're harvesting bamboo shoots. They're using bamboo as, wood, as lumber and stuff. And so there are these tracks that are set up that let the bamboo slide down the mountain easier. They're made out of bamboo, and it's like this bamboo road. And Bebe says this for the really large bamboos that they cut down and then they drag down into the village for repurposing as, buildings and whatnot, scaffolding and stuff. As we're exploring this bamboo pine forest nature reserve at the peak of Tongmu Pass, the mist starts coming in, and it's really cool because you can see just big swaths of mist coming in over the mountains. And even though the mountain valley is not large and not vast, right, you can see people walking up and down the path on the other side, the mist comes in and just totally obscures it. And if you stand there long enough, it'll pass and the world comes back. But for these moments of time, you really just can't see anything up there. The mist is so thick and so heavy. Really, really beautiful. Again, adds this feeling of being in another world. But after exploring a little bit, we go back into, the tea room. We start drinking tea. Again, it's last year's tea, and we're drinking it with Grandfather Zhang. Grandfather Zhang is a pretty cool guy, very relaxed, very reticent, I guess. Doesn't say so much, but he did tell us about what it used to be like in the 80s and how difficult it was to, sell their tea. And so Bebe's family, they've been making tea for 5 generations. So 5 generations meaning Bebe's great-great-grandfather, I believe, was the one who started, planting these bushes and growing these teas. However, the tea economy has not always been amazing, right? I think it was really good. A lot of red tea was being sold in the Soviet era. And then with the collapse of the Soviet Union, a lot of the tea sales dried up, right? A lot of the green or black tea demand and whatnot. And then compounded with that difficult terrain of the region, right? This is when Bebe's grandfather told us how the road was a modern invention. Before that, it was much more difficult to buy or to make and sell tea, right? They'd have to make a bunch of tea, then carry it down to the village, carry it down to the river, and then from the river begin to sell it. And so the tea production hasn't always been very good. But one thing that happened, right, that really blew up this Masu region in a good way was not only the invention of the road. I guess with the creation of the road brought in a lot of new technology. And so the rest of the world was already using new machinery to make tea. But in Masu, they were still doing it in the traditional way because they couldn't, carry a machine on their backs up the mountain. They had to create the road, and then once the road was created, then trucks could come in. And with the trucks, you could get the really nice tea equipment and machinery. And this all happened around the 90s. And so in the Masu region, in Tongmuguan, in Zhengshan Xiaozhong terminology, there's this word called Xingongyi. Xingongyi means new production technology, new production methods. And this became really big in the 90s, where instead of having to smoke all the tea in your traditional qinglo to actually make it, now you have a giant oven that can dry the tea when you're ready to fix the flavors and whatnot. And this is something that I kind of go back and forth on, because what does this new machinery mean? It means that people like Bebe's grandfather can make a lot more tea with a lot less effort. And in so doing, they're not, bending over, rolling by hand all of their teas. They're not smoking and inhaling all of the smoke every day when they're making tea. They can make it in a very clean environment, and they make it in a more safe way, make a larger amount, sell more tea. And so Bebe's grandfather is totally sold on the new production methods, which is, for me, that's almost ironic. It's counterintuitive. A lot of people wouldn't assume that the older generation is gravitating towards the new technologies, but we see this up in Masu and Hefeng, in the mountaintop in Mayantai. It's the older people that are not doing organic farming. It's the older people that are reveling in the fact that they can just spray pesticides and it kills all the insects, spray herbicides and it kills all the weeds. They don't have to bend over and pick weeds anymore. Right? They can just add a little fertilizer and everything grows really well. For them, this is the definition of productivity. This is the definition of saving labor, right? This is what technology does. It creates leisure. And so you spray herbicide, you kill the herbs, and you don't have to work so much. The example here up on the mountain with Bebe Zhang's grandfather making tea in the new Xingongyi method with machinery and stuff is a lot more benign, where he's still making a very high quality product and it tastes great. Like if you've had the Masu teas, this is the Masu cinnamon that's made by Bebe's grandfather in that Xingongyi method, so it doesn't have smoke. It just tastes really, really clean. You get that cinnamon taste to it. The other one, the Tongmuguan, or the Masu smoke, this is made by Bebe's father and by Bebe. And so it's the younger generation that's carrying on the traditional methods of smoking the tea in the qinglo, which we'll get into in the next episode, because I want to really talk about how this tea is made and what it's like. But it's just really interesting getting up to the mountain and meeting these people and seeing that it's the older generation that's relying on the machinery and the younger generation that's trying to be more traditional. And that's why I'm just really loving this connection, because we see a lot of things that are upending expectations, right? It's Bebe, the daughter, who's carrying on the father's work to do the traditional methodology that the grandfather has, turned away from. And so the grandfather's making the new traditional methods. And again, I mentioned the fact that, it's Bebe carrying it on because a lot of the tea makers up on the mountain are male, are men. And so seeing, a woman getting into it, it's really great. It's a sign of the developing times, the changing of these social roles and stuff. But then she's still carrying on the traditional methods. When you get up into these rural villages in China, you have to really accept what things are like and the way they're doing things. And so it's really nice to find that nice contact from the wee mountain town, follow it all the way up to the source, and just be pleased and impressed by it all the way up. One thing I will say is when Bebe's grandfather was brewing tea, he brewed it so casually. Like he didn't care about first steep, second steep, third steep. His idea is there's always tea in the pot. There's always tea to be poured out into your cup. It's a very, I think, under the Maoist era, this is what tea was about. It's that social beverage that you always offer to everyone who comes. And so the idea here is there is no empty cup. The cup is always full in this sense of fecundity. And so it's really cool to see, 3 generations of tea makers all in one place, expressing their tea making, tea tasting in different ways. So again, I mentioned that this is the sourcing trip where we found them, but they're not making any tea yet. And so in May, I'll have to go back to the Tongmuguan region, back to Masu, and watch them make the tea. This trip, after we get up there, after we meet everything, see the bushes, we actually end up leaving before nightfall because Bebe doesn't want to risk the roads at night. And so we're only there for a few hours just to see everything, and then we make a plan to come back in May. And so the next episode of Tea Soup, I'll talk about what it was like in May, seeing them actually make this tea. And a spoiler alert for the next episode is that it kept raining. The rain did not stop, and so next episode it'll still be raining, flooding, not ideal conditions for making tea, but also one way that maybe the smoked tea is a really good innovation, because even if you have wet tea, you can still smoke it dry. Anyways, that's on the next episode. Again, guys, Derek from One Every Tea. Thank you for listening to this Tongmuguan episode, and I will tell you more about it the next time. Until then, guys, brew happy.